Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and finish up the growth scene. And all we really need to do is replace our previous plants and trees with the final trees. So what I want to do first is go to the display tags, and we're going to make some modifications to make sure that we don't overload the scene. So we're going to go to the level of detail for all of the tags and set them fairly low. Keeping in mind this will change some of the effectors, like the attracting effector, like the way these small trees are being cloned around the large trees. But at render time it will be correct. And when we go ahead and calculate everything, that'll also be showing correctly. I'm going to go ahead and turn off textures for everything. And anything that's going to have a lot of polygon detail, it's a good idea to set up just going into skeleton mode first. And then we can work our way from there and kind of build up the preview. Okay, so I've gone ahead and I have some X-Frog plants. I've just loaded into one scene and gone ahead and sorted them. I made a few scale changes to the plants, and you can see all of the plants are grouped together. The objects are moved, but the object axis and all of those are set correctly. So the only thing I had to do to modify the X-Frog plants was when I opened the scene, just grab the object axis and place it towards the bottom of the trunk, or in the case of the plants, towards the bottom of the stem. And that was the only modification I had to do, although there is one other thing. I did end up making a change in grabbing all of the materials, going to the material editor, with everything selected, and changing the texture preview size and only showing the color in alpha. And that's going to really help the preview build and refresh. So what I'm going to do is select all of these null groups and copy, switch over to the other scene, and we can go ahead and paste those in. I've gone ahead and opened up the material list, and for everything with no layer, which should be just all of the plant materials, we can add these all to a new layer and call these final veg. And we could do the same with the objects as well, or setting them up specifically for plants, the trees, in both groups. Now these trees are not going to be available with any of the content provided with the training. So if you are interested in any of the X-Frog plants, the X-Frog program itself, or the plugin for Cinema 4D, from what I've seen, it looks pretty nice. I haven't used the plugin. You can go to xfrog.com to check those out. I'm going to go ahead and create a null object to store the previous objects in. So removing them all from the current cloners. And this way, if I want to go back and modify anything specifically and use the previous objects, they're already saved in the scene. It's still available. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off all the cloners. And we're going to start with the trees. Grab all of these trees and add it to the large tree. And then I'm going to grab our small trees, and then all of the plants. Now we may need to make some scale modifications. because the previous objects may be quite different than these objects in their setup. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Because I went and set it up in the model mode, changing their scale in the other scene to at least match, for the most part, the way I'd want them to end up in the final scene. Plants may be a little bit small, but within the same groups, they're sized pretty equally. So that way, if we do have to make any major changes, it won't be per object, at least within the main scene, just within the cloner object. I am going to go ahead and turn off the rocks just to free up some resources, and start with going to the attributes. And now I'm just going to kind of keep in mind the count that I had. So 2000, I'm going to start at 200 and turn back on the large trees. Now it is set up to be skeleton mode. So we can go ahead and bring it over to the wireframe or using the box mode. Box is actually going to work quite nice with these trees because of the way they're set up. Instead of being one condensed object, it's a bunch of polygons contained within a null object. Now that does become more difficult when you need to assign any overall shaders to affect all of the clones, but for the most part for previewing, it's going to be great. Turn off the level of detail, and I'm going to go ahead and turn that back up to 2000. It looks like we may need to modify the overall scaling. I'm going to go ahead and do a render just to take a look and see how this is turning out so far. This scene is almost entirely being lit at the moment with global illumination, which I did just turn off just for a faster render. But you can still see, for the most part, the overall scaling. I think I'm just going to turn down these trees just a little bit in their overall scale. So I'm going to select the large trees cloner object, go to the attributes, and under transform, we can now step these down. And maybe I'll go ahead and bring them a little smaller. And I did just turn on the environment object, which I used to have in the scene, to create some temporary ambient light. The final scene would not use that setup because the sky object itself plus GI is all we're really going to need. The leaves are not set up for the backlight at the moment. So that is something I would go through in editing the materials and creating the backlight shaders for the luminance channels. But I can tell that I think I scaled these down a little too far. So what I'm going to do is grab those large trees and bring them up to 0.8 and also reduce the count to 800. Now we're going to go over to the small trees, and we can turn those on. And I'll probably need to change the size here. And I'm going to also modify the tag, turn off the level of detail. We can switch that over to wireframe. And I'm going to go ahead and switch the trees over to wireframe as well for their display. And we can start to see a much better preview. So the smaller trees, I'm also going to want to decrease the scale. Maybe 0.5. Now, a really important thing to also keep in mind is that because the scales can be vastly different between the different types of objects, between the previous object and also now the final, the way we're influencing the small trees to be created around all the larger ones may need some adjustments, which is going to be the small tree effect, going to the fall off, and what we can do is adjust the sample distance. So we can increase that to get it to work with the scene a little bit better without going into the water. But we should still have the effectors efficiently removing anything that's going to cause it to go into the water for the most part. I also think I'm going to go ahead and reduce the overall object count. Now that we can really see all the foliage in the scene, it's pretty easy to tell that we don't need quite so many to fill the scene. And we can adjust from there. Go ahead and bring down the scale. And go up to the trees again and bump that down to 0.7. I might even go ahead and lower the object slightly, which could also change the placement once we start modifying them beyond some of the different effector settings. So large changes can have a huge impact because even the water setting, a 1 centimeter change, because I am working in centimeters, was a pretty large change overall. So it looks like with that placement, it's also having the same effect. I'm also going to drop down some of the smaller trees a little. Go back and we can turn down the count. And I think that should be pretty good. And we can start bringing in plants. So we'll go ahead, turn on the plants. And we can see where those are showing. Because of the scale changes, they might also be showing in somewhat different places. For the most part, they should be okay where they're at. I'm going to adjust the size, and seeing the skeleton mode it can be really helpful for that. For little plants like this, it's really helpful. Especially when you have so many, such a large amount of objects being created. And it looks like there might be a small change with the way the water object is affecting these. Some might just need to be refreshed now that I have new objects in the scene. And I turned the water effector on and off, and now it did reset everything else. So I'm going to go to the back to the plants and change the seed amount. It looks like we just don't have things being cut out exactly as they were before. And I'm thinking that's actually a problem with the last change that was made to the scene, which is using the vegetation. So I'm going to just kind of bring it through the list and see if I can get what I'm looking for. because this one's going to be really helpful to have to cut out anything that we're not going to need. And I did just go ahead and change the scales on the trees. But I think what I'm going to have to do for the plants at the moment is to turn off that shader. Because of the different variations and changes, there's quite a few things affecting the plants. I think a different setup needs to be used rather than the same shader affecting the trees. So I'm just going to skip that right now. That's really just a lot of tweaking based on everything that I covered earlier. So we're going to take a look at the plants. Keeping in mind that I did have kind of a sort order turned on before, and I don't think I want to use that anymore because that was just for the two objects. So I'm going to turn off sort and switch that to a different mode. Let me set it to random. I also don't want to use the same which effector was sorting them. So basically the sort effector, we can turn that off. And then go ahead and take a look at a render. I'm probably going to go ahead and change some of the sky settings just because now with all the trees in here, the look of it just isn't as good as I originally had planned. So it is starting to look a little bit better. We can start to see some of the plants coming in. Because of the scale changes, I do need to bring those small trees back up out of the ground because they just don't look right anymore. And I might increase the large tree amount, and we'll bring it up to 1,000 just to fill it in a little bit more. So the plants I have set to 12,000. Because most of them being cut out, there's not actually 12,000. So I'm going to bring that up to 20. Maybe even 35,000. We might have to increase that higher and higher, keeping in mind that that is the overall amount throughout the entire terrain, so not even just what's showing within the view. So maybe even 45 might be needed. We can go ahead and turn the rocks back on. And I'm going to modify the sun and then go ahead and do another render. And I still need to make a few tweaks to the lighting, possibly remove some of the trees right in the front, or maybe some of the lower ones, but it is starting to look a little bit better. One thing I want to make a note about is the plants will look a little strange because it's the way they're set up is very grid-like, and the way they're placed onto the terrain at the moment. I think what's going to be a much better solution for this scene is using the same technique and the same method to place the smaller trees. I think using the rocks and then adding all the plants to be around the rocks, kind of poking up, would be the best, because that way we can get kind of little clumps together of different objects. Another thing you could do is just create another cloner object. One thing that would be really easy is just to copy and paste the current plant object and then go back to maybe the previous plants from before, or the trees might work a little bit better, and then use those to create all the other clones of the rendering plants around them, and that way you can get something that's going to look a little more realistic for the scaling. Now I'm just going to jump back in the frames to open the scene a little bit more. Also, there's no scaling change at the moment on any of the plants. They're all basically the same size. So that's also going to decrease the realism. And I do think that possibly changing the camera angle is going to be a good idea, just because of the way this part of the terrain is shaped. We could go into the displace deformer or create a new displace deformer using the same method that we used to cut out the trees to kind of push down the terrain a little bit right there, or just modify it, converting it to polygons to edit it. But I think it's just not really working well with the shadows or the different lighting setup, so I'd probably end up moving the camera and kind of shifting it to the left a bit so that this area that's sticking out would be just a little bit more to the right in the lower right quadrant as one of the major 4 points of interest of the frame. So here is a slightly larger version, larger render, better anti-aliasing to see some of the finer details a little bit better. And it really is just kind of cropped out right now because it is larger than the view at the moment. But you can see overall it's starting to look pretty good. Personally, I would like to go through and add those backlight shaders to the leaves. Just because overall I think they're a little too dark. Although with the global illumination it might pick it up, might look a little bit better, and you might not really have to worry about it. Also, the terrain obviously needs a lot of work. The texture doesn't quite look right. And then of course the clumping and grouping of the plants. I'd probably end up maybe just constructing all my own new plants for everything, but there is one thing I want to mention about using the Xfrog plants and the way they come by default for Cinema 4D. They are not set up for animation. All of the materials are set up for stills, so there actually are quite a few changes that would need to be done before this could be rendered. And it's really going to depend on the type of the object. But let's go ahead and take a look. Basically, when we go through all of the materials and any image map, the sampling modes, circle is used quite a bit. And it's not always going to be the best for animation. It's not really a mode you would use to animate with. So these all need to be set to MIP. And because every channel of every texture is different and has a different image, you probably won't be able to change all of them at once to modify the sampling type. But setting that to MIP is very important if you're going to be rendering any sort of animation. Otherwise the flickering is going to be really bad. Some final notes about rendering this out. So after all of those changes are made, one thing to keep in mind is a smaller preview render is not always going to be useful. So if you want to see if it's flickering or if there's any problems, rendering it out smaller, right now this would not be my final output. I think I'm going to render this out 1280 by 720, so 720 HD. That's also exactly what I would use, the full-size resolution for rendering any sample animations. Scaling down the frame size, cutting it in half, at least when we're working at this point. If I brought it down to 800 width, the way the sampling and the anti-aliasing is done, it's going to look worse. And I've seen a lot of times where render things out in a lower resolution to preview them, and they just flicker like mad. But when rendering at the full output with the same settings, it ends up looking great. So whatever your final output is going to be is what you should set up your test renders for. Because doing a little small preview render of a very small frame size isn't always going to diagnose any problems that you might be having. For the most part, once everything is set to the MIP, going to the anti-aliasing and the 2x2 by 4x4 is a really good starting point for this sort of a setup. If you have any camera motion, this scene in particular can be set up to use vector blur on everything, as opposed to using the full scene motion blur, which takes a lot longer to render. It's also important to set the filter to animation. If you're going to be using global illumination, there's quite a few things to keep in mind. Movement of the trees might be a little difficult to render out with without having to use very high qualities. It might cause some issues with the sampling, so that might be something you kind of bake into the scene. For the most part, what you can do, I have it set up to a very low mode at the moment. I've set this over to IR camera animation, and that's going to be a great start. From there, never use the preview mode for a final run. And one last thing, which we'll look at more in depth in a future section, is located under the options. If you're having any problems seeing kind of boxes around where the leaves should be rendering, outlining the alpha and showing the entire polygon shape and not being cut out properly, that has to do with ray depth and also the shadow depth. For the most part, ray depth is going to be something you may need to increase to a higher amount. What it does is it sets the amount of objects that can be seen through transparent objects. So if you have thousands of leaves, and looking through one leaf you would typically be able to see tons of trees, you would need to increase that amount a lot higher. I believe the maximum amount is 500. Yes, it is 500, so that's going to be the max amount you'd be able to set. Typically, I like to use between 100 and 500, just to make sure that there are no problems, especially when using trees or plants that I haven't created myself. Another thing that is very important is just to make sure that none of the alphas are set to the soft mode for any of the materials. That's going to cause huge issues because when it's showing light through the edges of leaves, it's a big flicker creator. So never use the soft mode for that. And if you're noticing any distant type flickering in your animations, one thing that will definitely take care of that, at least for any trees or leaves textures that are going to be flickering, what you can do is just start to increase the MIP scale, which is basically going to control the level in which it starts to blur itself out. This is a global control that's going to change every single MIP scale within every texture. There are also, and it looks like I've just found another problem that's going to need to be changed for rendering the animation. The blur scale is set to -75. So really, I mean, this is definitely set up for stills. This is not set up for animation. So the one change that needs to be made, at least to the older versions of the Xfrog plants, I'm not sure the newer versions, these ones were created quite some time ago. So negative values are typically used for stills to make things crisper, and then positive values are used to blur it out, used for animation. default is typically 0. Although everything is still overrode by the MIP scale within the render settings, set to 50 by default, and yet sometimes you might need to bump that up to 150, a little bit higher. So it's really going to depend. Other than that, I've had, at least with closer up vegetation, there's definitely no problems rendering 2 by 4 by 4 with the MIP scale set to 50. If all alphas are harsh alphas, not soft, and everything has MIP with no negative blur scale. So when you're using other content, just things to keep in mind and kind of check before you go ahead and start rendering anything. For stills, it's really no major change. Personally, I wouldn't use circle for any stills unless it was just easier to render out a larger frame and scale it down, rather than spending all the time going through the materials and modifying them. So that might be something you can do too, just render it out very large. So that pretty much wraps it up for this scene. Unfortunately, I can't provide you with this version since it has third-party content in it. But all of the other setups are still there. So you'll have the previs objects to work with and replace that you can modify. And any further changes I make beyond this point, I'll go ahead and save out, and that will be provided with the rest of the content. And there is one final note I want to make about modifying all the materials at the same time. I am just rendering something out right now. Just taking a look at the scene with GI. As long as all of the textures have the same channels turned on, or channels that are similar, you can select them all and modify them at the same time. So right now we have a mixture of bark and leaf materials. So if I was to select a selection of these, the alpha is not available. But if I was to select just the leaf materials, then the alpha becomes available. So we can select the alpha, change the sampling mode. I'm not going to do that right now because I'm rendering. And then you can also set your blur offset and your blur scales to the correct settings. So what I would do is change this over to MIP and then 0 and 0. So if all you really have to do is separate the leaves from the bark materials, and you could just use a very simple selection for that. If you take a look, I did switch everything over to the MIP, so there's a very obvious difference between the look from before. Now, I didn't have GI on earlier, but if we zoom in a little closer, same anti-aliasing setting, and you can see a huge difference between the look of the anti-aliasing. So this would not work for an animation, cause a lot of problems. This would need to make some adjustments to the lighting, which is where that backlight really comes in. So even setting up multiple settings for that material, also a possibility. If you're just going to use a direct color for the backlight, I like to use image maps with the different shaders.